Hello, this is a talk on emotional regulation for children with autistic spectrum conditions. My name is Jenny Harbridge and I'm the clinical psychologist working for Shepway Child Health. During this presentation, I'll be covering what emotional regulation is, why children with autistic spectrum conditions might have difficulties with managing their emotions, and finally looking at some strategies on how to help children learn to regulate and recognise their emotions. Not all of the techniques will work for everybody, but hopefully there's a range that you can try. There is no definite way that is always going to work for your child and for you. So we'll give you a range to look at and try out. I think the underlying message is that it's not impossible for children to learn to regulate their emotions, but it is quite difficult and needs some time and patience and practice. What even is emotional regulation? The definition is the ability to express a range of emotions and react in appropriate ways in emotional situations. So this might include adjusting well to new people and new situations, having a tolerance for frustration, being able to control negative emotions to be appropriate, and to consider the needs and the preferences of others. Now, we all have to manage our emotional state. Just think today whether you've maybe felt particularly excited or particularly fed up, anxious about maybe going somewhere new, or really angry and annoyed at maybe somebody's terrible driving. There's lots of times where we have to manage what's going on. What we'd like our children to learn to be able to do is to recognise what emotion they're feeling, to be able to predict what they might be feeling and what others might also be feeling, and be able to manage those emotions in an appropriate way. I think it's important to realise that it's not just the negative emotions, it's being really happy and really excited can also be things that children find a real struggle to be able to manage in an appropriate way. If we're good at managing our emotions, we might do this without even really realise that we're doing it. We're regulating how we're feeling. We might go for a walk, or we might put on some different music, we might grab a coffee, or we might consciously be aware that we're not supposed to laugh at something if it's possibly a serious setting, or it's a time when we're with people that we don't really know very well, so we're not quite sure about how to judge a situation. So people who can manage and recognise and regulate their emotions well can do it sometimes without. When I'm talking about emotions, I'm talking about the messages that communicate how we're feeling to our body. They can communicate through our body, through changes in our physiological state. They can communicate through our behaviour, and they can communicate through our minds, through how we're thinking. So, for example, in this triangle diagram, we've got behaviour, body and mind, which can change in real life to shouting and fighting would be the behaviour we could see. A racing heart might be one of the physiological symptoms we can feel in our body, and in our mind we could be thinking, what is he doing? Emotions are trying to tell us something. If we keep ignoring the message, they tend to just get much more intense. Sometimes simply labelling and acknowledging the emotion can help reduce its. It's really important to learn how to manage emotions. Negative and positive emotions can become very overwhelming, and I think when we add those into what we already know about autistic people's heightened sensory awareness and difficulties managing some of the social situations they find themselves in, this is just another area that adds into the mix to make life really tricky. However, we're not saying that emotions are wrong. they don't have a purpose. There's definitely a purpose to them, and they can be very helpful, but it becomes a more of a difficulty, more of a problem when people maybe try and suppress and bury what they're feeling and keep things really, really bottled up, or when people misidentify emotions. So behaviour that might be misinterpreted as angry actually comes from somebody being very frightened. And when people ignore their emotions altogether, it can be a problem. This diagram is called the zone of tolerance and tries to describe the wide variety of emotional needs throughout the day and how everyone can manage their emotions differently at different times and in different situations. It can depend on a whole range of things, including upbringing. If you're in a family where emotions are expressed a lot, and there's lots of hugging and crying and cuddling and laughing and things like that, you're going to have a very different response to emotions than somebody who is brought up in a family, for example, where things are kept very much to themselves or talked about very quietly, away from everybody else. Different temperaments, we all have different ways of responding to things. Some of us are much more kind of expressive and open about things, and others just operate in a very different way. So keep in mind this diagram, that in the middle is the zone where things are okay and we can manage them. At the bottom is the zone where there's too little going on, and we're not being stimulated enough. At the top, it's where it's way too much and we're hyper aroused. Most people find that quite difficult to manage, certainly over a sustained time. I'm going to read a passage from a book called The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night Time by Mark Haddon, which I think explains quite well this feeling of being really overwhelmed. The policeman did not give me enough time to work out the correct answer. Why were you holding the dog? He asked again. I like dogs, I said. Did you kill the dog? He asked. I said, I did not kill the dog. Is this your fork? He asked. I said, no. You seem very upset about this, he asked. He was asking too many questions, and he was asking them too quickly. They were stacking up in my head. The policeman said, I'm going to ask you once again. I rolled onto the floor and pressed my forehead to the ground again and made the noise that father calls groaning. I make this noise when there is too much information coming into my head from the outside world. The policeman took hold of my arm and lifted me onto my feet. I didn't like him touching me like this, and this is when I hit him. So we know that there is a real struggle for people with autistic spectrum disorders to try and understand the neurotypical world. There are really high prevalences, I think usually around 50% is quoted in studies, of people who present with kind of clinically recognised levels of anxiety, frustration and anger. Often problems with anxiety and frustration come across expressed as anger because the person might be lacking the ability to really express what they're anxious about. All of the cognitive difficulties and understanding and sensory issues that we know that people with autistic spectrum conditions have will all contribute to the difficulties in recognising and managing emotions. Difficulties in managing emotions is a really real problem for people with autism. There are very high prevalence rates of mental health difficulties if these aren't addressed and the person helped to manage them as they get older. We know that the need for saneness, rituals and routine helps somebody to feel calmer and able to manage better, but the world isn't always like that, unfortunately. If you're somebody who doesn't like and becomes very anxious in social situations, you're going to be somebody who maybe wants to avoid go into those kinds of situations. Sadly, that reduces your opportunities to practice strategies and to learn how to manage, maybe in small chunks, the anxieties and maybe the unpleasant feelings that arise from those situations. Learning to manage emotions, uncomfortable emotions particularly, is really, really important for people with autistic spectrum disorders in order that they can get the most out of life and be able to respond in the best way to situations rather than getting themselves into trouble, for example, exclusions from school or into trouble with the police at the extreme end. This is a diagram from the book, The Autism Discussion Page. It describes some, I'm sure there are others, of the influences that a person will be experiencing all the time and be all feeding into each other. So navigating the world is a bit of a balancing act between kind of managing all of these different areas. So we've got cognitive difference, so I don't really understand what's going on. We've got sensory regulation issues, all of those things. It might be easy to handle one or two of those things possibly, but trying to deal with them all at once can get pretty difficult. And that's where the feelings of being confused, overwhelmed, frustrated, scared and anxious may come from. This is a further diagram produced in 2014. It comes from a presentation that is actually available on YouTube by typing in those details in the corner. So we're looking at all the different elements of autism, again feeding into how emotional regulation can be managed. So in terms of function, an autistic person might be less organised and have more goal-directed emotion and more internally driven processes. Cognitively, we know that there might be poorer problem solving and a preference for rigid behaviours and perseveration, keeping to the same idea, and impaired perspective taking. In terms of information, there'll be difficulty filtering environmental stimuli and identifying social and emotional cues. Psychiatrically, there might be present some other mood and anxiety disorders. There is belief that there can be some changes within the brain, so some differences with the amygdala, which is the kind of emotion driver, as well as the prefrontal cortex functions, which affect emotional regulation and also behaviour. Often altered physiological states, so hyperarousal and extra hypersensitivity to all sorts of things, and a degree of negative versus positive affect, so greater baseline levels of negative affect and intensivity. As you can see, it's a really complex situation, and I think will answer for you why telling somebody to maybe go and calm down is something that they actually really can't do, but that's something that they will definitely need to learn to practice and rehearse and be successful about in some situations and not so successful about if in others, especially if there is a succession of those different difficulties all kind of piling in at the same time. So what might we see, or what might you see in your child? You might see an increase in repetitive behaviours. You might see an increase in aggression, including injury to themselves. You might see an increased withdrawal, so those children who are keeping things kind of blocked in rather than expressing out. You might see a general deterioration in behaviour, more meltdowns, outbursts and explosive behaviours, and more crying, sadness and anxiety. also more anger and irritability. And that's from the research by these people. So it's a very tricky situation, and that's why we want to help them get on top of it and be able to manage it. When we're thinking about emotions, we also need to bear in mind this kind of iceberg model. If any of you have been on the Signet course or similar, you'll have seen something like this before, where the presenting behaviour, what we see, what we hear, what our child tells us that they're feeling maybe is anger. But that's the top of the iceberg. All of these things underneath can be the things that are driving that difficult emotion, that there's something going on that's getting confused and isn't able to be dealt with or expressed in the best way, so it's expressed as anger. Anxiety is a key feature of autism, and it can be managed, but it's really important for parents and psychologists and teachers and other family members to be able to recognise when their child is feeling anxious, even if that's not exactly what they're saying they're feeling. So here are some kind of phrases that you might be hearing that actually need to kind of make you have a little think of, is there something else going on? Is there something else that maybe actually is the problem underneath this? So lots of tummy aches and headaches can make you kind of think, it might be a headache or a tummy ache, always check that first, but think, is this happening every day before school, or is this always happening before this person comes to our house, or something like that, and be able to try and work out what might be the actual underlying reason for them saying these different phrases. Is it actually an anxiety issue? When children are having a really difficult time managing their emotions, they're often described as having a meltdown. This needs to be understood to not be a temper tantrum. All children will still display temper tantrums, but they tend to be much more goal directed, and the behaviours are very different. A meltdown is not manipulative, it's not designed to obtain something, it's often more of a catastrophic reaction. It's like a boiling over or a kind of a volcano eruption type situation where there's extreme stress, extreme stimulation, and the emotions are stronger than the child's capacity and their skill to regulate them. So that's when the meltdown might occur. So this is the third section of the presentation, looking at how we can help to manage these emotions. So it's important because we want to reduce stress and find out what are the triggers, so we can head off the problems before they get too serious and too difficult to deal with. But we also want children to recognise and regulate what's going on. We need to help children think about feelings, how they can be different to each other, how there are different ones around that all have different names, and that might occur in different situations, and that there are positive ones and more tricky ones to manage as well, and they all have their place. So very basic emotions are a good place to start. So happy, sad, angry, scared, those are a good place to start, and then build on from that. Different families and different children have different words for different emotions, so go with the ones that you know and that your child is aware of, and try and get them to describe what it feels like and what it is. So how would you know if somebody was anxious? How would you know if you yourself are feeling anxious? What might be those behaviour signs, those physiological signs, and those brain signs thing? Remember the triangle diagram of mind, body and behaviour to look out for, and to start being able to think about what's going on. I think we'll also kind of touch on the fact that emotions tend to not be an on or off switch situation. They're very much on a continuum, on a kind of a dimmer switch or a sliding scale kind of situation. We'd suggest starting with more positive emotions like happy or excited, and use those as the way to get that conversation going with a child and getting them to recognise the different signals that they can be looking out for. Once you can identify how you're feeling, you can start to look out for it, identify what's caused it, and think about how you can communicate what's going on and what you can do to kind of manage it. One of the first things to try and do is to try and help the child put some words to some sensations that they will have to learn to recognise. With autism, we're dealing with two quite big words. One is alexithymia and one is interoception. So alexithymia is difficulties in identifying, describing and processing your own feelings, and is often marked by lack of understanding of the feelings of others and difficulty distinguishing between feelings and the bodily sensations of emotional arousal. And this is found in 50 to 80% of people with an autism spectrum condition. Interoception is known as the latest kind of sensory system within the body. It's the awareness of your own body and the systems within that body determining well-being and emotions, and will also account for things like recognising feelings of hunger and feelings of temperature management and needing toilet signals. So all those systems are going on in our body, and we know that people with an autism spectrum disorder really struggle in many cases to recognise that that's what that sensation, that feeling means. So drawing a body map can be quite a helpful place to start, and is sometimes quite fun. We suggest the child lying on a floor on a giant piece of paper, and somebody drawing around them, and then trying to go through the different areas of the body, looking at what some of the feelings might be for the different emotions. So looking at things around what your face might be doing, what might be happening in your tummy, what might be happening in your hands, for example. So this diagram on this person might be somebody coming from an anxiety emotion. If your child doesn't want to lie on the floor and be drawn around, obviously that doesn't have to happen. It can be a drawing that they do themselves, or a cutout, or whatever is going to work. We don't want to make somebody more anxious just to achieve the aim. We would then say move on to a different picture, a different diagram for a different emotion. So you'd end up with a range of them, and it's a way to help the person learn about recognising and having a think about there being a difference between the different emotions and being able to kind of categorise them. And I think lots of people like science and like kind of facts and figures. So if your child happens to be one of those people, they might want to look up in a book or look up online about the way the brain works and the way different emotions happen, the role of the amygdala in the brain, the way of the frontal lobes in the brain working as kind of planning and brakes, learning about the fight, flight and fright system of anxiety can all be really useful. There's loads of stuff online on YouTube that you might want to kind of search for and look at with them. Also things technological things like apps on phones or some kind of smartwatch or fitness tracker can be really helpful in helping a child recognise, for example, fast heartbeats. And some of them have kind of relaxation exercises that they can do and watch the numbers or graphs or whichever device you're using, watch that change, and helps the child understand the link between what they're doing and the effect it has on some of those physiological systems. This is another technique for helping children to recognise the different emotions. So there's different sensations and characteristics listed around the outside, and the child is encouraged to read them, think about them, and circle any of the changes that they might notice. It's helpful, obviously, if you can do that as well. There are plenty of videos, doodles, diagrams, talks available all over the place to try and explain different emotions. This site, Anxiety Canada, has a lovely video designed for children about anxiety. They have another one designed for slightly older children talking about anxiety. So that might be something you want to look up and have a look through before you share it, possibly with your child. Another technique that goes into a little bit more detail might be something along the lines of this worry worksheet, which analyses what's going on and through questioning helps a child work through what might have happened and what they might be able to do about it. A really helpful technique to use in learning to manage emotions is the use of scaling techniques. So we've got two different ones here. You'll probably find that school have a similar system in operation. It might be like this, or it might be a traffic lights kind of system. What they are trying to do is to explain to the child and everyone around them that it's not an on-off switch, that it is more like a dimmer switch. Often parents will say that they are not aware of any triggers before a meltdown or outburst happens, and because the change between kind of calm and explosion is extremely rapid and extremely fast, over time what we find is that children realise that actually it's not an on-off switch, it's a sliding scale or a dimmer switch, but they're just very good at kind of suppressing and hiding what's going on at the kind of lower numbers, so that before anyone knows about it, it's already got as high as a 4 or a 5. So another advantage of using these kind of number systems is that in times of high stress and high emotion, it's quite tricky to find words to explain what's going on. The child's already feeling under a lot of pressure and has a lot of things going around in their head without having to try and put things into words. If the work is done before the child understands what these numbers mean, at a calmer, non-stressful time, we can work with the children to find out what they are feeling when something's at a level 1 or a level 2, and talk about what kind of things escalate it up, but also learn about what kinds of things can help them calm back down again and move back down the scales. In much the same way as we were talking about before, we can help pull this apart in terms of what something might feel like, what it might look like, what kind of sensations might be going on for them, what somebody with them might be able to see and recognise in that child and in that situation. It's helpful for children to feel reassured that this is not a permanent kind of scale, that throughout the course of a day it's actually quite typical that we will go up and down in terms of our emotional state, our alert levels. This kind of fits in with that zones of tolerance diagram that we looked at earlier. So there's lots to be gained from this, and families feedback that it's really helpful to be able to just hear a number and know what needs to be done. Some children might say, actually, by the time I'm at a 4 or 5, there's not a lot that can be done, and actually if you try to, that's just going to make things escalate and make things worse. But if you can notice when I'm getting to a 3, these are the things that can help me, and actually when I'm at a 4 or a 5, what I need is to be left alone, or to have some calm down time, or to have maybe some special music, or to be kind of directed to a quiet place and given a specific activity that helps me to get back in control and regulate what's going on. The scale on the right hand side is called the Incredible 5-Point Scale by Carrie Dunbar and Mitzi Curtis, and there's lots and lots of resources available using that reference. Here we have applied the 5-point scale to an anxiety curve. So as you can see, it explains about the path to the explosion, meltdown situation at the top, where not an awful lot can be done to try and prevent things, but also to describe that there is a process of coming down from that as well. Using the 5-point scale as levels of kind of heightened emotion. I mentioned earlier about how difficult it is to just ask your child to calm down and expect them to know what to do. Unless they have learned or been taught and practiced, then that's going to be a real struggle. This is an example of a set of things that one child has said that helps them to feel better. You can link this with the scaling examples. So what kinds of things help you get from a 3 to a 2, or from a stop you going up to a higher number, whatever language the child feels most comfortable with, and run through the things that you learned about feeling the different emotions, feeling different calms. If your heart rate's going fast, what are the things that help try and make that reduce? So some really slow, deep breathing will always help, but sometimes a child might need a cue to help them with that. So by counting on their fingers, so counting to 5 is a good prompt, or remembering a particular piece of music, or thinking of a song, or imagining a place, imagining something that is a calming activity, like stroking a cat. If they need to do something much more concrete rather than just thinking about an activity, have a list of activities readily available for calming down activities. So for most children, doing computer games is actually not calming. It raises their levels of arousal and levels of that's not fair and I must just finish this next thing, those kinds of examples. So something that's sometimes more calming and doesn't need as much external input can be much more helpful. These are really personal, so it's very important to go through and find out what's going to work for the child that you're helping. Even learning how to breathe is something that they can practice. So learning to do deep, calm breathing involves breathing in through the nose and slowly out through the mouth. To help children remember that, it's good to have something to remember breathing in the smell of, so something they love the smell of. This is a flower. Other children say that actually they love imagining they're breathing in the smell of their favourite food, or a favourite perfume or something like that. And then the breathing out is if you're going to blow a giant bubble, it needs to be done very slow and very gentle and very steady, and that practicing that breathing at a time when you're not stressed or not emotionally upset can be a really helpful thing, because when you need to use it, the knowledge is there of what to do. This exercise is called a grounding exercise. Again, it's based on a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is a handy thing to remember. You've usually got a hand with you. Think of this example chooses 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing about yourself, to just focus in on the moment and let all the stress and worry that's going on go away somewhere else. In a way that suits your child and your family, try and build up a picture of the things that make them feel happy and relaxed. This gives you a lot to aim for when creating the materials that you need to provide to help them. Some children are very arty crafty, some children prefer using computers, some people prefer using books. So come up with lots of ideas. It might be that you create a scrapbook or a little notepad so that it's always around. When your child is looking, to all intents and purposes, like they're happy or calm or relaxed, maybe check in with them and find out if that is how they're feeling, and remember what that activity is that they're doing. These are all resources that you can come back to. It's a resource pack. No one solution is going to work in every situation, every setting, so it's really helpful to have a large range of different ideas to put into practice. You might want to think about the people and the places that these different activities occur, and have those all in your kind of pack of important resources. Another strategy to use is to engage your child's special interest, whether that's a particular character or a particular hobby or interest. Get them to think about maybe what that character would do if they were feeling anxious or angry. Think about an example that maybe they felt that way, and what did they do and how did they cope. It helps the child put something into a much more concrete place rather than it being an abstract idea. If they can think of another person doing it, that's the next step to helping them think about themselves doing something. The zone of tolerance that I mentioned earlier on can be a useful tool in helping keep a diary or chart or record of some kind of how things are going, and when maybe they haven't been going quite so well, to have a think about what might have been some of the triggers involved, thinking about the triggers, the emotion and the autopilot reaction. Some children are good at doing this sort of dissecting and recording. Other children find it much more difficult to understand. So pick what's going to work in your situation. You can also use these images and ideas to create a further scale of the 1 to 5 version, or the dimmer switch version of when somebody's a bit relaxed or really relaxed, for example, just to reinforce and re-emphasize the idea that it's not an on or off switch, that you can be doing things that make you feel slightly more relaxed and things that make you feel extremely relaxed, so that you have a range of things for different situations. This is a nice breathing exercise to practice breathing out in a slow and controlled way. If you breathe out too quickly, the cup will overflow and you'll end up with a sticky table. If you can blow in a slow and controlled way, you can get a really big pile of bubbles on top of your drink. It doesn't have to be milk, it could be water or any drink that your child prefers, but the aim is to get a really big fluffy head of bubbly hair on the top of the cup. An Australian clinical psychologist called Tony Attwood has created an enormous amount of materials for children with autistic spectrum conditions, and has written lots of books and produced lots of materials and training. His specialist area is about emotional regulation. He has plenty of talks available on YouTube if you'd like to track those down. When we're talking about all the resources and tools and strategies, he has called those an emotional toolbox. This will include physical tools, relaxation tools, social tools, thinking tools, and other tools. And I'll tell you a bit more about what he means. So, for example, a physical tool will be something that gives a quick release of energy, like a hammer. It could include physical activities that use lots of energy and can help repair some of those feelings of anxiety, anger, or stress. So it could be used to represent activities that provide a release of emotional energy, such as running or jumping on a trampoline or walking the dog. Relaxation tools operate in a different way. They operate on a slow release system. So the picture here is of a brush, because a brush can be gentle, can brush away the stress, can represent anxiety, relaxation strategies to lower the heart rate. So it might be things like having a bath, listening to music, or stroking the cat. Or use whatever activity it's going to be that works for your child. So if a physical tool for your child would be hitting the punch bag, that's the one that you could talk about. There's lots of different ones. Creative destruction can count as a physical release. So ripping up a big pile of newspaper or throwing things into the recycling bin, jumping on some popping plastic can really help. For other children, it's swimming or dancing. Put some of the relaxation activities that you have already worked on from previous exercises into this toolbox. So the ideas of maybe watching a film, cuddling a teddy, having a massage, using some mindfulness, pictures of nature and things like that, maybe pictures of pets. Social tools are tools that involve other people or pets, friends, family. Sometimes things just work better when there's more than one person involved. Maybe that person doesn't need to do much, but maybe they can just help change the mood or soak up some of the stress. Maybe social tools could involve thinking about, what if your friend was feeling like you do, what could you say to them? What would help them? And would that help for you? Maybe we can use talking in a way that can help manage a difficult situation. Some people like to phone and talk to somebody. Other children, when that's suitable and allowable and safe for them to do so, might want to text or message their friend to get some support at a difficult time. Of course, some children may definitely wish to have time away from people in order to manage their feelings. Pets are often a good choice in terms of social tools. Pets are very good at listening, and pets also like a calm person to stroke them and snuggle them, and are very good listeners. Under social tools, we're not always talking about physical hugs and affection. For a lot of children, that can be very tricky and needs knowledge on how to handle. Some children might want a hug, some children might just tolerate somebody touching the back of their hand. That it all needs to be discussed with the child. Tony Attwood talks about thinking tools regarding the thoughts and messages that you're thinking in your head. So it's important to try and identify certain thoughts that are poisonous, that might be repeating themselves in the child's head, and thinking about alternative thoughts, antidote thoughts that can reverse or fix some of those anxious feelings. So there's some examples here. The thinking in the head might be, I always make mistakes, and the antidote thought to learn, to remember, to maybe have a prompt card for, is that everyone makes mistakes some of the time, and that's okay. Another one might be, I can't cope. The antidote thought would be, I know where to get help when I can't cope. The essential point to remember when using thinking tools is that it's about finding techniques to challenge the evidence that's currently being thought. So it's a two-part thing. You have to find what those thoughts are and then find the evidence to challenge them. Where is the evidence that this is true? Is there another way to think about it? How can I get this into perspective? If this happens, how bad is it actually going to be? And what's the worst that can happen? So this is quite an advanced technique and is usually used with slightly older children who are able to catch some of those thoughts in their head in the first place. Work with your child to go through these different strategies to help answer these more difficult thoughts. You can be a good model as a parent for how maybe you would manage a calm or tricky situation. So using positive self-talk, perspective, reality check, confidence boosting and imagination, and cued control relaxation, children can move on from becoming stuck in some of the thinking traps. Cued relaxation is using an item from a different situation to put the child back into a relaxed state, so possibly a pebble from a nice day at the beach or a conker from a nice walk in the woods. There's always room in a toolbox for random tools that you find to be useful once and you keep because they might come in useful one day again. So these could be things that just you randomly pick up along the way that help the child to manage some difficult situation. Using their hobbies and interests can be another tool. Sometimes these hobbies and interests can provide really important distraction and kind of instant relaxation in a tricky situation. It can be tricky to manage sometimes because once a child is involved in something that they really love, it can be difficult to move them on. In the toolbox itself, there wouldn't be these actual tools necessarily. It could just be a picture of something. So if a child is really interested in the weather, you might put in a picture of some weather-related event, and that is enough to cue them to use that tool. Humour can work and lighten the situation, but again, used carefully. You know your child and you know when they might find that actually much more irritating. Pretending that somebody else is doing this. So what would Doctor Who do when he went to the dentist, or she went to the dentist? Distraction using counting or other methods can also work really well. And let's not forget that there are always going to be inappropriate tools. Sometimes these are the things that children have been using for a while and it's going to be difficult to stop them. They are tools, they're not effective and not necessarily very appropriate. Things like hitting or violence or running away, breaking things, hurting someone else, they're inappropriate. So these might go in the box, but they need to be talked about why they're in there and maybe have some symbol next to them of these are solutions, but they're not actually appropriate solutions in most situations. You also might want to put in things that help, such as sunglasses or a hat with a big peak that help manage bright lights, or ear defenders to help manage very noisy situations. So all of these would go in other tools. In reality, the toolbox can look like anything really. This picture is of the tools in a basket. I've seen a wide variety of very well decorated shoe boxes in my time. They don't always contain the tools. They might contain some relaxing items, so some of the relaxation things like a squeezy ball or a comic that they can read to calm down, photos of favourite pets or members of the family. Different tools can be written on paper, they can be on card or laminated to give them a little bit more life. Thinking tools might be cards of reminder things for them to think. A box can be kept at home. There can be a duplicate one at school or at a childminder's or other member of the families, so that the child knows where it is and what's in it and where they can go to get that support and advice if they need it. And obviously the adults supporting them can access it too. So once you have established a range of different strategies and practiced and rehearsed the different techniques for dealing with some difficult emotions, the next stage is to help your child learn to put those into practice in new situations and to be able to predict how they might react in some different situations. So you might want to kind of be aware of this and look for opportunities to practice some of these things. You want to try and minimise the impact of some of the triggers. and the changes of routine or a situation might be the things that trigger that. So you might want to kind of prepare for them rather than jumping straight in at the deep end or avoiding altogether. We're talking very small steps, but preparing and planning in advance can help the child feel that they're not being subjected to a sudden, unexpected and really unpleasant change. So make use of the things that we've talked about. The thermometer 1 to 5 scale hierarchy system can apply to situations as well. So a situation where they might feel completely fine might be something that's a 1, whereas they might be able to offer a situation that for them feels like it would be somewhere much higher up the scale. You want to build up some positive experiences of coping, so use that scaling technique to work your way up, so the child begins to feel confident that they can put some of those strategies into action. A dry run can be really helpful. So for example, here it's talking about going to a cinema. Maybe go to the cinema, arrange with the cinema to go at a time when it's very quiet and there aren't lots of people there, and have a look around. Not go to a film, but just check out where the door is and the toilets are and which screen you're going to go in and what the procedure is going to be. Find out if they do a performance where it's quieter, or suggest an alternative relaxed performance that some cinemas and theatres now offer, so that the child doesn't have so many questions. When you have been on something like a dry run, either in real life or online, you can do various tours around things online or look through webcams and things at places. You might find yourself with a whole long list of questions, and some of those thoughts that we mentioned earlier. So for example, talking about going on a school trip, you might be able to look on the website and get information about what sorts of things are going to be there and what kinds of things that the trip is going to do. And then your child might come up with lots of worries and questions and concerns, such as there might be loud noises. What if I get lost? What if I don't like the food? I might not understand what everyone's saying if they all talk at once. That gives you a lot of material to work with, in order to give your child some phrases to think back to themselves, and also strategies, practical strategies to put into place. So they might think, well, loud noises aren't nice, but they won't hurt me, and I could take my ear defenders in my rucksack if I need to wear them. I could stick close to my teacher so I don't get lost. If I do get lost, the teacher will say a place where I have to go, or I find somebody in a uniform and go and ask them where to phone my teacher. So there's different strategies that can be put into place, and other people can be involved in planning this and are probably very used to planning these kinds of things. Give the child some encouragement to come up with some strategies themselves, thinking about their toolbox, thinking about the different things that can work for them that have maybe worked in the past or worked in similar situations. When you're brave enough, you can go and try these things. Like I say, try them in small steps if possible. So we're not expecting them to go on a solo shopping trip without any support, but maybe they can go with you and they can do the very last part of the shop by tapping something over the checkout, or saying goodbye to the checkout operator. So a very small step, but all the time they can be watching you and watching what you're doing, so that they can learn what to do and what to say as the situations proceed. Lots of modelling, lots of rehearsal and role play can really help make things move on here. If you show your child how you might do something, there's no need for you to be perfect either. You can struggle a bit and make it clear which strategies you might be using to try and sort some things out. All of the things on this slide are things that we've talked about earlier in this presentation, and are things that with good practice and prompts to think about them, or to go to the toolbox and think about the tools the child can gradually learn to put some of those into place and make some progress in the things that they're happier to approach and attempt. Reassurance can feel like the most natural thing in the world as a parent or supporting adult to say to a child, but a note of caution that whilst it can be helpful, it can become another way for the child to avoid doing something if they're constantly looking for reassurance before they actually try things. So although it's certainly, we're not saying don't reassure your child, just bear in mind that too much of that is not moving things forward. We want to really encourage them to generate and put into practice some of their own strategies, and therefore not need constant reassurance that they're doing things right. We want them to believe themselves that they're trying their very best. So it's about finding a kind of a happy balance that's going to work. Some children like to have a worry time, so it acknowledges the time to worry and allows that, but puts a kind of boundary around it. So it might be a certain time of the day and for a certain amount of time, and that's all. In reality, you unfortunately are not going to get rid of strong reactions altogether. The world isn't like that, and like we say, this is a very long kind of process, and there will be some new situation that will come out, and the combination of factors will knock your child sideways on that occasion. And sometimes only a hammer will do. That will be the only tool that's of use for them in that particular situation. Remember what we said about meltdowns. Sometimes that release of tension really needs to happen in order to kind of clear everything out of their system and be ready to kind of start again. We need to try and find a balance between modifying the environment all the time and avoiding anxiety and avoiding angry outbursts, and allowing a certain amount of that in order for them to practice their strategies and techniques. The world isn't going to be able to be as controlled as maybe our homes are, and that's not doing our children all the favours. Once they're feeling more confident and feeling able to try things, then we can try and move out into the kind of the wider environment and see how resilient they can be and how they can put some of these tools into practice. But it's all about being realistic and being kind and being observant and keeping that communication going in the way that works best between you and your child. I think we need to also be realistic about what's actually worth the battle. So a busy shopping trip for a week's shop on a Saturday morning is probably asking an enormous amount of a child who finds all of those things in a supermarket very stressful, and from a parent who will also probably be very stressed because of the same situations and may not respond to their child in the way that they'd like to. So if they don't need to come shopping on a Saturday morning, for example, maybe that's something that can be avoided, but not avoiding shopping altogether. Maybe doing a smaller visit to a shop on a quieter time is going to be the way to gradually build up those kind of skills and exposure. Despite all your hard work, it might still be the case that for a long time your child may struggle to see the relevance of all of this to their actual real life. They might really like doing all the tasks and learning activities and putting the toolbox together, but won't actually use it when it could be helpful because they don't see these skills as relevant and may not recognise the same situation that they learned before, so they won't apply their toolbox tools to it. So I think it's an ongoing process, lots of prompting and rehearsal, encouragement and modelling from yourselves and other adults in a supporting role to remember some of these skills and to help the child feel reassured and enabled, and give them confidence that they can manage what might seem to them a very tricky and overwhelming situation. These are some further resources to look into in terms of trying to practice relaxation. Everyone responds to different things, so it might be that you have to try a few things out. So there are relaxation CDs available. There's plenty available on Spotify and other streaming services. There are apps that you can get that play relaxing music and ones specifically aimed at relaxation, and there's plenty of free ones as well as the ones that you subscribe to. You can even buy white noise machines that can operate in the background to help with calming down and focusing on a very kind of monotonous and unstimulating noise. Finally, you can record yourself reading a relaxation script, or you can find a similar thing online, but the familiarity of your voice might be something that your child responds to well. These are a selection of some of the many books that are written to help children manage their feelings. Some of them are ASD specific, but most of them are applicable to all children, so they can easily be worked through with all members of your family or along with friends or cousins. We can't recommend any of these books in particular, but these are the ones that we have used and that families have given us good feedback on. If you find any others, please let us know and then we can share those as well. So we've come to the end of the presentation now. I hope that you've picked up some useful tips and ideas. On this slide and the next couple of slides, there are a few more graphics that you might wish to look at and have a think about as well. Any feedback will be really gratefully received, and we hope that you have lots of fun trying to get things sorted out and get to know your child really well. And we hope that they have a very happy time in the future. Thank you.